Frida Lyngstad of ABBA, so often seen smiling, performing, holding the group together, has finally spoken. And what she's just admitted about her ex-husband Benny Andersson and his closeness with Agnetha Fältskog has left fans stunned. For decades, she stayed silent. She never told the full story. Until now. In the mid-1970s, ABBA was unstoppable. They weren't just another pop group. They were a global phenomenon. Dancing Queen, Mamma Mia, Take a Chance on Me. The songs weren't just hits. They were cultural landmarks. Fans from Stockholm to Sydney memorized every lyric, every harmony, every perfectly choreographed stage move. But what made ABBA so special, so unforgettable, wasn't just the music. It was the story behind it. Two real-life couples, Frida and Benny, Agnetha and Bjorn, singing songs about love and heartbreak while living those very same realities. Fans didn't just buy records, they bought into the idea that love and art could coexist. That the stage wasn't just a performance, it was a reflection of something real. And for a while it was. Frida Lyngstad and Benny Andersson were the quieter couple of the two. They didn't spark headlines like Agnetha and Bjorn did. They weren't the golden couple with magazine-ready good looks. But to many fans, they were something more enduring, solid, steady, safe. Frida, born in Norway and raised in Sweden, had a voice that could move mountains. She was strong, elegant, and magnetic. She carried herself like someone who had seen hard times and survived them. Benny, the reserved musical genius behind much of ABBA's sound, was her balance. Creative, sensitive, and driven by the music, he seemed like the perfect counterpart to Frida's fire. They weren't flashy, but they were believable, rooted. When they got married in 1978, it felt like a quiet triumph. By then, ABBA was at their peak. They had conquered Eurovision, taken over the charts, and proven themselves to critics who once wrote them off as just another shiny pop act. They had money, fame, adoration, and to the outside world, love. But behind the scenes, the very success that had elevated them to global icons was beginning to wear away at their foundations. Benny lived and breathed music, and Frida, who had always admired that about him, was starting to realize how lonely that kind of devotion could be. He would disappear for hours, sometimes days, into the studio. He was constantly experimenting, producing, chasing a sound that only he seemed to hear. He loved Frida, yes, but he loved the music more. She later said, in a quiet interview, "Sometimes I wondered if I was competing with a piano. There were no screaming matches, no scandals, no dramatic affairs, at least not yet. But there was something more dangerous. Silence, distance, a kind of emptiness that crept in when neither person wants to admit they're drifting." Frida tried. She planned dinners. She arranged quiet moments in hotel rooms between tour stops. But Benny was always somewhere else. And the more she reached for him, the more he pulled away. Still, she never imagined it would fall apart. Because at that point in time, ABBA was everything. To walk away from Benny would mean walking away from the band, from the dream, from the image millions of fans around the world had come to love. So she stayed. She smiled. She sang love songs with the man who was slowly slipping away. And maybe, if things had stayed just between them, the story would have ended differently. But it didn't. Because right there, sharing the same stage, the same spotlight, was another woman. A woman Frida had come to trust, to perform beside, to protect. And that's when everything began to change. Agnetha Fältskog had always been more than just a bandmate. She was a star in her own right long before ABBA took off. With her golden hair, delicate features, and crystal-clear voice, Agnetha was often positioned as the face of the group. But what fans didn't see, what Frida saw up close, was how fragile that spotlight could be. Agnetha had gone through her own heartbreak. Her marriage to Bjorn had collapsed, painfully and publicly. While ABBA's lyrics got more emotionally raw, "The winner takes it all, one of us." Those songs weren't just art. They were real. And Benny noticed. He began spending more time with her, at first out of support. At least, that's what Frida told herself. In interviews, it was easy to explain. They were writing partners. Benny and Bjorn were always tinkering with something, always drafting new material. If Agnetha happened to be in the room, it was just convenience. That's what Frida told herself, until she couldn't anymore. Started small. During rehearsals, Benny would find a reason to adjust something in Agnetha's mic setup. He'd linger by her dressing room a little longer than necessary. He'd really laugh, at things that seemed to Frida barely amusing. She noticed his tone shift when he spoke to Agnetha. He became gentler, softer, more present, and when Frida was around, that softness vanished. Frida once recalled a moment on tour when the group arrived at a hotel late after a long flight. The plan was simple: room keys, quick dinner, sleep. But Benny was missing. When he finally showed up, Frida didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She could smell Agnetha's perfume on his coat. She didn't ask. He didn't offer. And the next night, they stood together on stage like nothing had happened. Singing about love. Singing in harmony. That's the thing about emotional betrayal. There's rarely a confession. No dramatic confrontation. No caught in the act. Just silence, coldness, and a deep, aching feeling that something you loved is slipping away, and you can't prove why. Frida wasn't foolish. She didn't need anyone to spell it out. She saw what was happening in the smallest of ways. How Benny looked away when she spoke. How he stood closer to Agnetha on stage. How the crew started to treat her differently, more carefully, like they were afraid of breaking her. And yet, through it all, Frida didn't lash out. She didn't accuse. She didn't run to the press. She didn't even cry, at least not where anyone could see her. She kept showing up. For the fans. For the music. For the version of Benny she still remembered, even if that version no longer existed. She once said in a later interview, "I was surrounded by millions of people, and still, I had never felt more alone." Even as the band continued to perform, ABBA was crumbling from within. And while everyone saw Agnetha's heartbreak in the lyrics, no one noticed Frida's heartbreak at all. Because hers wasn't in the songs. It was in the spaces between them. By the turn of the decade, the cracks within ABBA had widened so far that even their closest collaborators couldn't ignore them. The music was still polished. The harmonies were still tight. The photos were still glossy. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Backstage, conversations grew shorter. Interactions were stilted, forced. Frida would often sit alone, quietly applying her makeup while Benny and Agnetha laughed about something across the room. Whatever had once held the four of them together, love, friendship, ambition, had begun to disintegrate under the weight of unspoken pain. No one dared confront it. The managers didn't want to interfere. The producers were too focused on getting another hit out the door. And the fans? They had no idea. They saw Frida twirling under stage lights, her voice soaring through sold-out arenas. They saw Benny at the piano, his head tilted toward Agnetha as they shared a microphone. But they didn't see the moments in between. The silence in the dressing room. The coolness in Benny's voice when he spoke to Frida. The look Frida gave Agnetha when she thought no one was watching. Not angry, just tired. So deeply, unmistakably tired. There were no fights, no scenes, no screaming matches in hotel lobbies. There was only absence. A slow vanishing of affection, of loyalty, of the version of ABBA that once felt like family. And for Frida, that silence was the hardest part. No one said it out loud, she would later confess. But we all knew. We all knew something had been lost. Still, she performed. She stood on stage beside Benny. She harmonized with Agnetha. She sang lyrics about devotion, about unity, about love, while wondering if any of it was still true. And when the applause came at the end of each show, she bowed like nothing was wrong. But something was. Something had been for a long time. And everyone around her had made the same quiet decision. Don't say it. Don't break the illusion. But illusions can only hold for so long. By 1981, it was over. Frida and Benny announced their divorce in a brief, carefully worded statement. There was no scandal, no press conference, no public unraveling. Just the usual phrases: creative differences, personal growth, a mutual decision. But Frida's silence in those days spoke louder than any headline ever could. She didn't cry publicly. She didn't share heartbreak ballads or give exclusive interviews. She simply stepped away. And those who had followed her for years, those who really knew her, saw the difference immediately. The light in her eyes was dimmer. Her smile, still gracious, still warm, felt quieter, less sure of itself. When asked years later what really ended their marriage, Frida didn't offer gossip or detail. She didn't blame Benny. She didn't defend him either. She just said, "I lost trust." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to, because anyone who's ever loved someone they couldn't quite reach anymore knows exactly what she meant. For Frida, the pain wasn't in a single betrayal. It wasn't about an affair or a dramatic reveal. It was in the accumulation of absences. Of all the times Benny could have chosen her and didn't, of the moments he could have noticed her sadness and chose to look away. "It wasn't that he hurt me," she once said in an off-record conversation. "It was that he let me hurt," and said nothing. In the aftermath, ABBA pressed on. They performed. They recorded. They smiled for photos. But something had changed, and everyone felt it. Even fans who may not have known the details sensed the difference. There was a distance now, a formality. ABBA was no longer four people in love with the music and each other. It was four people holding together a legacy while quietly falling apart. Frida bore it with quiet dignity. She stood on stage next to the man who had broken her heart. She harmonized with the woman whose presence had haunted her marriage. And she did it all for the music, for the fans, for the version of herself that still believed in the dream they had once shared. But privately, she was preparing to leave. Not just the band, not just the marriage, but the story everyone thought they knew about her. The moment she stepped away, she didn't just close a chapter. She closed the book. And for decades, she refused to reopen it. Until now. For years, Frida refused to talk about it. She turned down interviews, avoided documentaries, changed the subject whenever Benny's name came up. The media moved on. The fans didn't. Because while ABBA's music lived on in stadiums, soundtracks, and weddings, Frida's silence became its own mystery. The strongest voice in the band had suddenly gone quiet. And then, years later, she finally broke that silence. It didn't happen in a dramatic TV interview or an explosive memoir. It happened during a soft-spoken sit-down, long after the headlines had faded. The interviewer asked her a simple question. What was the hardest part of being in ABBA? Frida paused. She looked down. And then, she answered. It was pretending to be happy when I wasn't. It was the first time she had ever admitted it. Publicly, plainly. Not about Benny. Not about Agnetha. But about the cost of holding it all in. The interviewer didn't push. He didn't have to. Because a few moments later, Frida added something else. Just as quietly. I knew. I always knew something wasn't right. No accusations. No specifics. Just the truth. And that truth hit like a thunderclap. Because for decades, fans had speculated. They'd asked, did Benny and Agnetha get too close? Was there something between them? Did Frida ever know? Now they had their answer. She had always known. And that knowledge, silent, unspoken, had shaped everything. Her marriage, her music, her exit. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just spoke the words that had sat quietly on her heart for so many years. Sometimes, she said, the things you don't say become the loudest part of your story. And fans, those who'd followed her from the first curtain rise to the final encore, were stunned. Forums lit up. Comment sections exploded. She finally said it. She never wanted revenge. She just wanted peace. This broke my heart, because Frida hadn't come to stir drama. She had come to close a chapter, to let go not of the memories, but of the weight. I don't hate anyone, she added, but I had to forgive him from a distance. I had to heal without answers. And maybe that's what struck fans the most. She hadn't needed Benny to say sorry. She'd already made peace on her own terms. For decades, people had been waiting for a bombshell. But what Frida gave them was something far more powerful. A confession wrapped in grace. In the years that followed ABBA's quiet disbandment, Frida Lyngstad disappeared from the spotlight. No tell-all interviews. No tabloid scandals. No angry memoirs. She moved to the Swiss Alps, married again, chose a life of privacy and peace. And still, the questions followed her. Why had she stayed silent for so long? Why didn't she ever expose what happened between Benny and Agnetha? Why had she walked away so quietly when she could have told everything? The answer, it turns out, was simple. Some truths, Frida said, don't need to be shouted. They just need to be released. She didn't need revenge. She didn't want pity. She just wanted to move on without bitterness. That's what made her story resonate so deeply. It wasn't about betrayal. It was about dignity. She had stood on stage beside the man who broke her heart. She had watched her marriage unravel one silent day at a time. She had seen the whispers, felt the distance, endured the cold looks, and never once stopped showing up. And then, when it was time, she walked away, with grace, with strength, and with the quiet confidence that one day, the truth would take care of itself. Years later, when asked about Benny in an ABBA reunion documentary, she smiled gently. "We were very young," she said, "and we were trying to be everything to everyone. Sometimes, in doing that, you forget who you are to each other." It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't blame. It was understanding, the kind that only comes after decades of reflection. And maybe that's why, when Frida finally did speak, it shook fans so deeply. Because this wasn't a woman trapped in the past. This was a woman who had lived through it, learned from it, and survived it, with her head held high. Frida Lyngstad will always be remembered as one of the voices of ABBA. But those who know her story know she was so much more. She was the soul of the group, the steady heart beating beneath the glitter and gold. The woman who kept her silence, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. She finally spoke. She finally let go. And in doing so, she gave fans something more meaningful than gossip. She gave them closure, and a reminder that real strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it sounds like nothing at all, until the moment you finally say, "I knew. I always knew. And now, so do we." For more of the latest news, check out this video.